Up next here are a bunch of still photographs that tie in with the previous video clip. I'm going to run through these relatively quickly because I think the video clips covered it pretty well, and at the end of all of these I'm going to have another video clip just doing a brief overview of everything as well. So this is going to be quick and simple. What you see in this picture are the two spruce filler strips that need to be glued to the top of the front spar, so I have something to mount the hinge to. So on the left side there you can see the filler strip is already in place on top of the spar, and on the right side there the piece is just sitting on top of the ribs getting ready to be installed onto the spar. Here are the two pieces in place, and I took my piano hinge and cut it into two individual pieces. Those pieces are then screwed through the filler strips into the T-nuts just like you see here. And then coming up is just another picture of the same thing from a different angle. Again, the extruded piano hinge bolted through those filler strips that have been epoxied on top of the spars. Now you can see that the hinges are split in half. Obviously that's to clear the center rib. That center rib will be cut out eventually, or it has already been cut out if you've watched the videos, and the hinges just need to be split to clear that little nub that's left over at the top. Now the hinge was installed so that it would be flush with the top of the filler strip. The two heavy filler strips that the T-nuts are attached to, the hinge comes even to the top of that. Now you can see the pieces of plywood that go back along the edges of the end ribs. Those sit on top of that filler strip. So I had to add this long length of plywood on top of the hinges to make up that gap difference. And again, I'll cover all of this more on a follow-up video. This is a photograph of the length of plywood that was added to the back cutout area to give a ledge for the bottom to epoxy to, as well as the little weights holding down the cap strip fillers along the back, or no, this is the front, or is it the back? It's the back. The filler strips that need to be put in place on the bottom of the spars, again to make up the gap difference around the perimeter so that the bottom of the center section has something to epoxy to. This picture here basically just is a different angle of the same thing. So once all these parts are epoxied in place, in order to mount the metal fittings on, you need to have the areas of those fittings varnished. So I elected to go ahead and varnish the entire center section at this point. And what I do is I wash everything down with water. I get all the dust and debris out of all the nooks and crannies, and I had done that with the center section. Just took it outside with the water hose and washed it really good inside and out. All the crevices, all the crevices and nooks and crannies, I shoot them with water really well to get everything out. And then I had taken everything out into the garage, and I had hung it from this metal clothes hanger. Now this is obviously not the center section. For some reason I didn't get a photograph of the actual center section being sprayed, but I just suspended my parts from this metal clothes rack. I covered the garage floor with plastic. I used a water-based spar varnish from Minwax. I used the pump-up sprayer that you see in the background. To the right, that's the sprayer that I used. Diluted the water-based clear with a little bit of water to thin it, and then just sprayed the center section and all my other various pieces right from the rack and let it drip dry, and then come back with a brush and clean up any runs. Here is the bottom view of the center section after it has been varnished, and I had already primed and installed the metal fittings. As I said, the fittings needed to be put in place permanently prior to installing the floor, and prior to installing the fittings I needed to have the varnish in place. This is another shot from the rear of the center section. You can see the cap strip filler on top of the rear spar, and it stops short of the U-shaped cabane fittings, and that again is just a filler so that when I do epoxy the bottom in place, it has something to attach to all the way around the perimeter as well as across the bottom of the spars. Here I'm applying the epoxy to the various pieces of cap strip and plywood pieces that the bottom is going to attach to. That is the bottom just to the left of my hand there. I had it strategically placed so as I went around with the epoxy I can lay it in place and have it go on as soon as all of the epoxy was done. This is another picture of the epoxy applying process. These are the filler strips, again the filler cap strips epoxied onto the spars to make up that gap. And I can't stress that enough. You need to make sure that you have all of your gaps filled so that when you epoxy the plywood bottom in place, it has something to attach to at every possible point. Here's an inside view. This is an overall view of the floor in place. The slightly modified compression strut, I just had moved that as discussed previously. The modified fitting with the modified backer plate all primed and in place. You can also see at the top the filler strip for the hinge with the holes drilled through it for the hinge. Another overall shot of the completed floor. You can see that the floor plywood is a different color just because it has not been varnished yet. That gets varnished after the center rib has been removed, and I believe all that was covered in the video, the previous video, and I'll probably cover it again here in an upcoming movie clip. And then I move on to the lid, and there will be some other, I think I've got some other pictures of the lid, and again I'll cover this in the upcoming movie clip. But I elected to epoxy the hinge to the plywood lid, and I obviously decided on plywood as opposed to aluminum, which a lot of people use. I think this is a lot lighter in weight. And again, I just decided to epoxy the hinge to the underside of the center section lid. And it's a little bit involved at this point because you have to make sure that you leave room for the hinge to fall into the center section when the lid is closed, but you need to have the corners of the center section free of hinge so that it can overlay those long pieces of cap strip, and I believe I've got a couple pictures, or at least one picture of that. Yes, here is the lid in place on the center section. You can see how the hinge stops short and then the lid itself overlays those long strips of plywood that get epoxied to the end ribs. And this is another reason why I had epoxied that small length of plywood onto the hinges underneath the lid itself, just so everything again ends up on the same plane, so when everything is closed, when the lid is closed, it sits on top of plywood around its entire perimeter. There are no gaps, there are no spaces. And this is just another shot of the beveled edge of the lid. I beveled the edge quite a bit so the air will flow over the top of it smoothly. Once it gets past the fabric and over the hinge, the air will flow smoothly all the way back. This is a better picture, I think. You can see the hinge is bolted even with the top of that piece of spruce, and then there's a piece of plywood epoxied over top of that same piece of spruce where the T-nuts are, and I had to put a piece of plywood on top of the hinge itself underneath the lid, just so again everything will be on the same plane when the lid is closed. And here it is, temporarily in place. Again, it's a slightly different color because this has not been stained, or I mean it has not been varnished at this point, so it's a little lighter in color. I'm just pre-fitting everything to make sure that things close correctly, there's no binding, and that the entire perimeter of the lid is sealed. Now here's a couple of pictures that I will explain in an upcoming video clip. This is the method that I had used to when I get to the point where I need to bolt down the aluminum filler strips that fill the gap from the end of the wings to the center section. I wanted to bolt those through these 90-degree nut plates. So I had mounted these with epoxy on the underside of the long skinny pieces of plywood that run the length of the end ribs. These are placed underneath that piece of plywood epoxied to the ribs themselves. I forget, I think it's like every 6 or 8 inches I put these in, and then the aluminum filler strips will get wrapped around the ribs and screwed down through these nuts. And again, I'll explain that in an upcoming movie clip. This is a good picture of the cutout, the finished cutout area, as well as the added fake barrier, if you will, of plywood to keep anything that's stored in this back area of the center section. This backer keeps those items from moving up into the pulleys and or the cables of the ailerons. This is an alternate view. You can see the plywood is in place. You can see the blocks that have the small pieces of Velcro attached to them, and you can see the pulley assembly behind the barrier. So this is a small storage space for small items, and the barrier just keeps those items from interfering with the cables and the pulleys. And then another overall view. This has got, obviously, the center rib has been removed, and everything has been varnished on the inside. The fake backer is just barely visible behind the rear spar. You can see the filler block with the T-nuts and the various plywood pieces in place for the hinge for the lid, and then an underview shot of the center section, again with the floor in place, and it's been varnished, and the fittings. You can see now how the fittings have to be permanently installed because of the shape of the metal fittings. You can't pull them back through the center section bottom once it's in place. So that's why the varnish had to be done, the fittings had to be put on, and then the bottom of the center section.
Here's the finished center section. Obviously you can see the plywood top that I had talked about previously in the videos and in with the still pictures. I decided on plywood because I think it's lighter than the aluminum, and with it configured the way that I have it configured, I think it's just as good as an aluminum top. Now, I did not stain, I did not varnish the top of the top because I'm not sure yet if I'm going to paint it, just leave it like it is and paint it, or if I'm going to try to wrap it with fabric. I don't think fabric's going to work because this is so thin and flimsy. I think the fabric will probably just rip it apart when I try to shrink it, even if I shrink it just a little bit. So more than likely this will be painted whatever color I decide the wings to be. But for now I just left it as it is. And I've got my fittings permanently installed because, like I had said, once the bottom goes on, these can't come back out without cutting big access holes into the bottom plywood. So these are in, of course the leading edge is in, and this is what I was talking about earlier in the video. I would not put these strips in place until after you have the leading edge in place and after you have this cutout plywood in place. You could do this first, and then you have to make sure that this plywood ends up in the same location as your wing plywood. If your wing plywood comes, to about here, and you end up putting this plywood down here or up here, you're going to have a mismatched seam. Even though there's going to be that aluminum or some other kind of filler here between the wing and the center section, you still have that mismatch. So you want to try to get this plywood lined up with the plywood on the wing. It's probably not all that critical. No one's going to climb up on your plane to look at it, but still, it's something to consider. So once you get this in place and you get that back plywood in place, then you can just fit these in between the two. Okay, what else? Here are the latch mechanisms that I chose. These are just simple keyed latches. I've got them unlatched at the moment. They're both keyed the same, so you can lock this shut and you can only need one key. And then the inside is all cleaned out. The center rib is gone. Everything has been stained, or man, I'm stuck on the stain word. Everything has been varnished. And this is a nice big open area for storage. Now I'm going to try to hold this open with my head so I can use my hand here. This is just 16th inch plywood, and at the moment there's nothing else reinforcing it, so it's got some give to it. I may come back with some more cap strip and maybe put some supports either across this way or maybe across this way to stiffen this up. I'm not sure yet, but for now I'm going to leave it like it is. Here you can see the 90-degree nut plates. These are in various locations. I don't know if you can see that one in the corner here. And again, these are for eventually when the wings are in place and I get those filler strips put on between the center section and the wing. That filler is going to screw into these nut plates, and you can't see them. Well, you can see the holes maybe, but I've got these across the bottom, and then I've got some under here as well. I don't know if you can see that, the holes. And then the inside of the lid has been varnished. And here are my latch mechanisms. This is that reinforcement that I talked about before. These are the actual latches, the keyed latches here. And let me see if I can prop this open with my head. Well, if I do that, then you won't be able to see what I want to talk about over here. Oh, it's nice and dark in there too. Again, this is the I don't know what you want to call it, but this is just another wall barrier type thing that I had put in place to protect the cables and pulleys, because this area in here I'm going to use for storage as well, and again I don't want whatever I put in here riding up into the cables and the pulleys, so I put this barrier, and it's just held with the blocks of wood and the Velcro. And then what else? I guess that's really about it. I guess that is about it, really. I can't think of anything else. I'm sure a lot of things I think will become clear as you progress through the build of the center section and you get everything laid out and you start piecing it all together and getting it fitted. Okay, well, I guess this last video clip's not going to be as involved as I thought. I'm going to keep it simple and short because this video is already going quite a bit longer than I had anticipated, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So there it is. That's the finished center section for my aircraft. I will wrap this up with a wrap-up video of myself, and then eventually I will get to work on hint video number 8 already. I did forget one little thing. You can see these pieces of cap strip that I put in here. There's this one here and there's this one here on the other side. These are for these metal latches. When you swing, when you put the key in the latch and turn it to lock it, these arms swing over and they will actually latch underneath this cap strip. And it just worked out perfect that this space between the arm and the plywood here, this gap ended up being almost exactly this 1/2 inch span. I think I had to take these down a little bit, but it's very, very close. And of course, these pieces of cap strip are a reinforcement for this edge of the plywood. And like I had said in the video, this is a very simple, lightweight way of making this cutout, because it's just a couple pieces of this thin 1/16 inch plywood, some pieces of cap strip, and balsa wood. It's very lightweight. I don't know if this will show it because of the shadows, but you can see the blocks of plywood that make up the curve. So there's not a whole lot to it, but it is incredibly strong. I mean, this really isn't gonna go anywhere. So that's it. That's the little tidbit that I forgot that I wanted to point out. All right. See you in a bit. Hey everybody. Just wanted to say real quick again, thanks for checking out my YouTube videos, and just a couple of real quick tidbits before you leave. If you'd be so kind as to check out my GoFundMe page, the link is down in the description of these videos. For those of you who find it in your heart to donate for this new cause of mine, I've got another project going on, and there's some really cool things I'd like to do with this aircraft, and again, that's all explained in my GoFundMe. But if you find moved enough to go do that and donate, I've got this horizontal stabilizer skin, and donors will get their name put on this skin, and ultimately when this gets filled and the aircraft gets finished, this is going to be hung up on the wall of honor in my hangar. Just a little bit of recognition for those donors who helped make the project a reality. Another thing too is, I'm sure you've noticed that even this video that I'm making right now is of the same or worse quality than the video that you just watched, and that's because, believe it or not, this camera is the exact same camera that I filmed the original hint videos with. So I just wanted to point that out. I'm not really sure why, but I know the video quality lacks, but hopefully the information within is worth something. And the other thing that I want to mention real quick is, again, these are little snippets from my hint video DVDs, so a lot of these individual clips just kind of come to an abrupt end. That's just the way it is when I'm trying to rip these DVDs apart and re-edit them into small little segments, and they just kind of end weird at times. But that's it. That's all I wanted to say. And again, thanks, and I hope you'll come back, check out my channel, and see if there are any new videos and updates. All right, I'll talk to you then. See you.